On the morning of November 14, 1957, dozens of black sedans pulled up to a country estate in Apalachin, a small town in upstate New York. Inside the house of local businessman Joseph Barbara, more than 100 men had gathered from across the United States and even from abroad. They came in expensive suits with gold rings and soft voices. Officially, they were business people. In reality, they represented the most powerful criminal organization in American history. What happened next would go down as the single greatest intelligence disaster in the history of organized crime. A state trooper noticed the unusual gathering, roadblocks went up, and within hours more than 60 men were arrested or identified attempting to flee through the woods in their fine Italian suits. Names, faces, connections. For the first time, the American government had proof that the Mafia was not a myth. It was a nation within a nation. But one man left earlier than the others. One man always seemed to leave before the storm arrived. His name was Carlo Gambino. Carlo Gambino was born on August 24, 1902, in the village of Cacamo, near Palermo, in Sicily. He came into a world that had long been shaped by an invisible system of loyalty, silence, and controlled violence. In Sicily, the organization known as Cosa Nostra, meaning our thing, was not simply a criminal network. It was an alternative government, one that operated by its own laws and demanded absolute obedience. The Gambino family was already connected to this world. Carlo grew up understanding its codes before he could fully read. He was a small, thin boy, quiet and observant. He watched before he spoke. He listened before he acted. These were not learned skills. They were instincts. At the age of 19, Carlo Gambino left Sicily. In 1921, he slipped into the United States without official papers, arriving on a ship that docked in Norfolk, Virginia. He traveled north to Brooklyn, New York, where a Sicilian community had already established itself in the streets and tenements of the city. His cousins, the Castellano family, were among those already building a life there. He arrived with almost nothing, but with something more valuable than money. He arrived with connections. The Brooklyn of the early 1920s was a world of immigrants and ambition, of sweat and struggle, and also of remarkable opportunity for those willing to operate outside the law. Prohibition had transformed America. The federal government had banned alcohol, and in doing so had created the most profitable black market the country had ever seen. For young men with the right networks and the right temperament, there was money to be made in extraordinary quantities. Carlo Gambino entered this world carefully. He began working within the Brooklyn Underworld under the protection of the Mangano crime family, led by Philip and Vincent Mangano. He drove trucks. He moved merchandise. He handled logistics. He never drew attention to himself. While other young men boasted, Gambino calculated. While others spent their earnings on display, he saved. While others created enemies carelessly, he cultivated allies with patience. The late 1920s and early 1930s brought enormous upheaval to organized crime in New York. The Castellamarese War, a brutal conflict between the faction of Joe Masseria and the Castellamarese group led by Salvatore Maranzano, tore through the underworld. Men fell in restaurants, in barber shops, on sidewalks. The stakes were the control of New York itself. Gambino aligned himself wisely. He survived not through force alone, but through intelligence. When the war ended with the elimination of both Masseria and Maranzano in 1931, a new structure emerged. The five families of New York were formalized. The rules of the commission were established. And Carlo Gambino, still a relatively young man, had demonstrated that he knew how to navigate violence without becoming consumed by it. Through the 1930s and 1940s, Gambino continued his rise within the Mangano family. He oversaw labor rackets, controlled dock workers' unions, built connections with politicians and law enforcement. He never sought the spotlight. He was not the type who wanted his name in newspapers. He wanted power, and he understood that visible power was fragile power. Real authority lived in the shadows. Albert Anastasia was different. Anastasia was one of the most feared men in American organized crime. He had been a senior figure in what was darkly referred to as Murder Incorporated, the enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate. He was impulsive, volatile, and ruthless in ways that made even hardened men uneasy. When Vincent Mangano disappeared in 1951, along with his brother Philip, Anastasia took control of the family. The official story was never quite confirmed. It did not need to be. Carlo Gambino served under Anastasia as underboss. He was loyal in appearance, efficient in practice, and always perfectly composed. But beneath the surface, he was watching. Anastasia's methods were creating problems. He was too erratic, too visible. He made decisions that threatened the stability of the broader network. Other bosses on the commission were growing uncomfortable. Vito Genovese, one of the most ambitious figures in the New York underworld, was especially restless. By the autumn of 1957, a plan had taken shape. The details of who gave the final approval, who made the arrangement, and who carried it out have never been fully established. What is known is what happened on the morning of October 25, 1957. Albert Anastasia arrived at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan for his regular appointment at the hotel barbershop. He sat down in chair number 4. The barber draped the white cape around him. Anastasia closed his eyes. 2 men entered. In a matter of seconds, it was over. The most feared man in New York was gone, and Carlo Gambino was now the head of the family that would bear his name for generations. Within weeks of taking control, Gambino faced the chaos of Apalachin. The meeting, organized partly to legitimize the new leadership arrangements across the families, became instead a catastrophe of exposure. But Gambino's reputation survived it. He was identified as present, but he had not been arrested fleeing through the underbrush like so many of his colleagues. The investigation that followed caused immense damage to others. For Gambino, it was manageable. What followed over the next decade was a masterclass in consolidation. Gambino moved methodically to extend the family influence across every profitable sector of New York criminal economy. The waterfront, the garment industry, construction, trucking, restaurants, garbage collection. Every business that needed permits, labor, or protection found itself eventually within the orbit of the Gambino family. The money that flowed through these operations was enormous, but more importantly, it was quiet money. It moved through layers of legitimate businesses, through holding companies and partnerships, through cousins and associates who had no obvious connection to anything improper. Gambino also worked to build his position within the commission. He cultivated relationships. He resolved disputes. He positioned himself not as the loudest voice in the room, but as the most trusted one. When Vito Genovese was convicted on narcotics charges in 1959 and sent to prison, the landscape shifted again. Gambino emerged as the dominant figure in New York, and arguably in American organized crime as a whole. There was a concept within Cosa Nostra, both in Sicily and in America, of a supreme leader, the capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. Gambino was offered this title, or at least the substance of what it represented. He declined. He understood that formal supremacy brought formal attention. He preferred influence without the label. Law enforcement was never able to build a case that stuck. In all his years at the top, despite being under near constant surveillance, despite the wiretaps and the informants and the investigations, Carlo Gambino was convicted of serious federal charges only once, in 1970, on conspiracy charges related to a bank robbery. He was sentenced to 5 years but never served a day. Citing heart problems, he was released into home confinement. The case dragged on. Appeals were filed. By the time legal proceedings might have forced the issue, his health had genuinely deteriorated. What made Gambino so difficult to prosecute was not simply that he was careful, though he was extraordinarily careful. It was that he understood the distance between decision and action. He never personally handled money. He never gave direct orders to people who could testify against him. The chain of communication between his wishes and their execution passed through so many intermediaries, so many layers of plausible separation, that prosecutors could never assemble a chain that reached back to him directly. He lived modestly. His home in the Flatbush neighborhood of Brooklyn was comfortable, but not ostentatious. He drove his own car. He attended Sunday Mass. He was known in his neighborhood as a quiet, polite older gentleman who seemed fond of children and respectful of the elderly. The neighbors who saw him tend his garden in the mornings had no idea, or claimed to have no idea, who he was. He was also deeply committed to family in the most traditional Sicilian sense. His marriage to his cousin Catherine Castellano lasted until her death in 1971. The loss affected him deeply. He withdrew further from public visibility. His health, always a concern, declined more sharply after she was gone. In his later years, the question of succession became pressing. Gambino had not built an empire to have it fall apart when he was gone. He selected his cousin and brother-in-law, Paul Castellano, as his heir, bypassing his own underboss, Agnello della Croce. This decision would prove fateful for the family in the years that followed, planting seeds of resentment that would eventually produce consequences no one could have predicted. But that was for the future to sort out. On October 15, 1976, Carlo Gambino died of a heart attack at his home in Massapequa, New York. He was 74 years old. He died in his own bed, surrounded by family, with no handcuffs, no prison cell, and no final verdict that had ever definitively placed the full weight of his career before a court of law. His funeral drew hundreds. The mourners were quiet and composed. Flowers covered every surface. Outside, federal agents photographed faces and wrote down license plate numbers. It was the last act of a surveillance operation that had lasted decades and never produced the case they were looking for. Carlo Gambino left behind an organization that, at the time of his death, was considered the most powerful in the country. He had taken a position of danger in 1957 and transformed it over 20 years into something resembling institutional stability. He had done it without ever becoming the kind of man who made enemies he could not manage, who spent money he could not explain, or who spoke words that could be recorded and used against him. His name became attached to the most famous crime family in American history, even though he would likely have preferred no name at all. The family that bore his name would remain a major force in New York for decades after his death. Its internal contradictions, the ones he had left unresolved in choosing his successor, would eventually produce the dramatic trials and convictions of the 1980s. But Carlo himself had long since passed beyond the reach of any courtroom. He was not the most violent boss the American Mafia produced. He was not the wealthiest, and he was not the most flamboyant. He was something rarer and in many ways more dangerous. He was the most patient. He was the most disciplined. He was the man who understood better than anyone that in the world he inhabited, the greatest power was the power that could not be seen, could not be named, and could not be proven. The file the federal government kept on Carlo Gambino ran to thousands of pages, decades of surveillance, hundreds of agents, millions of dollars in investigative resources, and at the end of it, the same conclusion that had always been there at the beginning. They knew what he was. They could never quite prove it. That, perhaps more than anything else, was the measure of Carlo Gambino. The world that Carlo Gambino navigated in his first years in America was extraordinarily dangerous by any measure. The Sicilian immigrants who had built the early American Mafia brought their traditions with them intact. The rule of omerta, the code of silence, was not simply a guideline. It was a matter of survival. Men who talked did not live long enough to regret it. Men who stole from the organization disappeared. Men who showed disloyalty found their families living in a different kind of fear. Within this culture, Gambino demonstrated something that would define his entire career. He never gave anyone a reason to act against him. He was reliable. He was discreet. He delivered what he promised and asked for only what he was owed. In a world where the smallest slight could be fatal, he moved through years and decades without making the kind of mistake that ended careers and lives. His work during Prohibition was not glamorous. Gambino was not a showman. He handled transportation, distribution, warehousing. He ensured that the supply chain for illegal liquor moved without interruption from the point of production to the point of sale. It required organization, discipline, and an ability to coordinate with police, politicians, and rival operators who all had different interests and different prices. He managed these relationships with a competence that was noted by those above him. When Prohibition ended in 1933, the criminal organizations that had thrived on bootlegging were forced to adapt. Gambino adapted faster than most. The transition to labor rackets, to control of unions and industries, required the same set of skills. You needed to understand leverage. You needed to know when to offer and when to demand. You needed, above all, to understand human motivation. Gambino understood it deeply. The waterfront of New York Harbor was one of the most valuable pieces of economic real estate in the country. Every ship that docked, every cargo that moved, passed through a system of labor that could be controlled. The men who loaded and unloaded ships needed work. The companies that needed their cargo moved needed those men. In between, there was room for someone who could guarantee labor peace or threaten labor disruption. Gambino came to understand this space intimately, and the money it generated was steady, significant, and difficult for authorities to trace directly to any criminal source. The garment industry in Manhattan was similarly structured. The movement of fabric, the operation of factories, the delivery of finished goods, all of it depended on cooperation among dozens of small operators who needed reliable access to workforce and transport. Here again, the patterns were familiar. Here again, someone who offered stability and demanded a reasonable percentage could grow wealthy while remaining legally insulated. These were the foundations on which Gambino built his empire. Not dramatic moments of violence, though violence was always available when required. Not high-profile confrontations with rivals, though those too occurred when necessary. The foundation was economic. It was the steady accumulation of leverage across industries, neighborhoods, and institutions. In his personal conduct, Gambino was known for being impossible to read. He spoke little. He revealed nothing of his inner thinking. He made his decisions in private and announced them as if they were simply practical matters already settled. People in his organization learned not to debate him. Not because debate was punished, but because he arrived at conversations with his conclusions already formed by a process of deliberation that he conducted alone in the silence of his own mind. This opacity was itself a form of power. If no one could read Gambino, no one could anticipate him. If no one could anticipate him, no one could move against him. He lived behind a wall of inscrutability that was not performed but genuine. He was, at his core, a private man in an extraordinarily public and dangerous world, and he had learned that privacy was armor.